the month is classical music. Now, classical is the umbrella term for lots of different types of music, but it's generally seen as a high art music. Often nowadays, if I was to describe this to you, you'd think of music to accompany films or an opera, but generally it was the music that was made to stand the test of time. Unlike popular music nowadays, which is meant to be popular at a specific time, and then we get a different type of music and different, classical music is meant to remain the same and be appreciated the same, regardless of whether it was in the 1600s or in the present day. So it included the kind of early Renaissance period, the Baroque, the classical, the Romantic, and then the postmodern period. So lots and lots of different periods of music are all lumbered together under the classical umbrella. Classical music is associated with composers. Because the orchestra that performs it is so vast, it is not just like a band who are performing their own songs. So generally we have a composer who would write the music and then the orchestra who would perform it. If we think about developments in music technology, it wasn't until the last century when we would have the recording equipment and the digital tech in order to hear our own performances. So some classical music was only ever played live. For example, music performed by Mozart when he was around would have been performed live, and he'd have heard it for the first time when the orchestra performed it. And this shows how some of these composers were absolutely phenomenal musicians, because they were able to know what they were writing down would sound great even though they hadn't heard it. Whereas nowadays we have computer technology where we can type it into a program, hear what it sounds like, edit and tinker with it. So in a way, this makes it easier for us, but also, is it taking away that element of good musicianship from us? I'll leave you to decide that one. Now, we had choral music and early Renaissance music, but in the 1600s there was a big classical era called Baroque. Now, the most notable person to come out of this era was Bach, and he wrote many songs which have influenced lots of music nowadays. Some people think that Bach's left-hand technique in the organ is very similar to modern jazz music, so you can listen for that. Now, that music lasted for a long time, and it was music where people would go to watch, to listen to it, to escape from their daily kind of chore. Then in the 1750s, it's seen as the beginning of the classical era, with lots of composers you may have heard of, like Mozart, Haydn and Beethoven, amongst others. And they wrote lots of music which had symphonies where sometimes they were over an hour long. So it's music that you could go and kind of shut off and enjoy. It was art music, music to be appreciated. Then in the 1820s, we got into Romantic music. So the era of music is Romantic, where the orchestra started getting bigger, and people like Beethoven, he had to make bigger rooms, so we got the orchestra hall. Okay, so it was just to house all of his musicians. Now, Beethoven is an interesting person, because he was slowly going deaf, and so by the time he was writing his last few symphonies before his untimely death, he couldn't hear what they sounded like. So as we spoke about earlier, we didn't have the technology to hear what it was. He couldn't even hear it once it was performed. But what a phenomenal musician to know that it was going to sound good, even though he was writing it down and waiting for others to perform it. And then the last era is around the 1900s, where we got the kind of modern era of classical music, with musicians such or composers like Shostakovich and Stravinsky. Nowadays, we might associate classical music with films. We hear a lot of John Williams' work in films like Harry Potter, Indiana Jones, Star Wars, Jurassic Park, and we might also have heard of Hans Zimmer. He's another popular film composer, such as Gladiator and Pirates of the Caribbean. So what style indicators should you look out for when listening to classical music? Well, you would know that it's classical music if there's a full orchestra. So that means there'd be a string section, a percussion section, woodwind section, and a brass section. So a big orchestra. Generally, they might have a conductor at the front. So if you're watching it, there'll be someone conducting. And it's generally quite a long music. So it might have lots of different sections. And as I said, music might be an hour long. In between sections, it could differ in tempo. So some sections could be fast, some could be slow. It could generally speed up quite a lot or slow down. Sudden changes of dynamics from loud to quiet, different instruments coming in, different textures. If there's any vocals, it might be in the Latin language or in German. And there are obviously frequent changes of instrumentation and styles. So it's one of those where it changes a lot. So it's not just one song which kind of pieces together all the way through like modern pop. I think with this one, you know that it's classical, you just got to start to articulate the reasons why. So who do I recommend you to listen to? Well, for Baroque era, Bach, Vivaldi and Handel. For the classical era, I think you should listen to Mozart, Haydn and Rossini. For the Romantic era, I think you should listen to Beethoven, Tchaikovsky, Brahms, Mahler, Chopin and Wagner. And then for the 20th century, Elgar, Britten, Stravinsky and Vaughan Williams. And then obviously, as I've said, for the kind of modern movie scene, John Williams and Hans Zimmer. I hope that you find something that you like and you are able to discuss it at home and with other people in your class. So enjoy listening to classical music and hopefully you can compare it to other genres.